Yo, what's up, audio nerds? My name's Totem. Today I want to talk about the human ear, how it perceives loudness, and why that matters for your electronic mix. Stay tuned. So, the human ear is really interesting so far as how it perceives volume when exposed to certain stimulus. So, the standard signal path, so to speak, of sound as it travels through the ear to the brain is as follows. So sound comes in through the ear canal and it strikes the tympani or eardrum, okay? And the eardrum kind of vibrates with the amplitude and frequency of the sound, okay? And the tympani is nudging up against the two smallest bones in the body, okay? The one that's immediately connected to the tympani is called the malleus. It's kind of shaped like a mallet. And the malleus is attached to the incus, and those two bones vibrate with the tympani, okay? And the incus nudges the cochlea, and the cochlea is filled with fluids that translate the pitch and amplitude of that sound into a chemical process that's sent to the brainstem to brain, okay? And then the brain sends that signal back to the ear and the sound is heard. There is a muscle attached to the malleus that when your ear is exposed to a certain amplitude of frequency, I can't remember what the threshold is. I think it's like negative 14 decibels. So it's fairly low. But when it is breached, the tensor tympani is the name of the muscle. It flexes and it pulls back on the malleus. Okay, so it pulls back the malleus, and the tympani follows with it, and that attenuates our sense of volume, or it dulls our sense of volume. And inevitably, this is a protective feature against loud sounds that would otherwise damage our ear. So the tympanic reflex is the name for this function of the tensor tympani flexing and dulling our sense of volume when exposed to a certain threshold of sound. Now, why does this matter for music, and how does it relate to music? Well, if we know that when the tensor tympani is flexed, or the tympanic reflex is activated, that we are not hearing the full amplitude of the sound that we're perceiving. Our perceived volume is dulled in that moment. So when relating to music, dynamic range is the relationship between loud and soft frequencies. Okay? So when that ratio is greater, the dynamic range is greater. When that ratio is less, the dynamic range is less. So a less dynamic waveform, like I'll put up here, and this is usually, more analog style musics, rock and, classical and jazz and reggae. All these styles of music are going to be less dynamic than, say, an electronic mix that can achieve way more dynamics in a briefer period of time, given the sculpting of sound and silence that can be achieved there. So what that means is a less dynamic waveform is perceived as less loud than a more dynamic waveform that allows the tympanic reflex to reset, right? So what that means to me as an electronic music producer is that if I'm completely inundating my listener's sound palette, their tympanic reflex is activating, and in so doing, it's dulling their sense of loudness. So they're not perceiving the full amplitude of my mix in that moment because I'm completely inundating their palette. Whereas if I inundate their palette and then pull back and allow that tympanic reflex to reset and then inundate them again, then they're perceiving that full amplitude. And so when there's kind of a yoking, a coming in and a going out of dynamics, and I intentionally sculpt that in my mix, then it's going to be perceived as louder to my listener than had I sculpted everything on top of itself, like a rock mix, like a more analog style mix. I've heard Ill Gates refer to this as checkerboard and layer cake style compositions, where what he's saying is a layer cake is completely inundating and not incorporating silence or softness or more dynamics in the mix. And so because of that, the tympanic reflex is always flexed and the sense of loudness is dulled. Whereas what he calls a checkerboard mix, where you're consciously placing one thing at the center of the soundstage at a time and then dynamically changing that one thing intentionally. It doesn't mean that's the only thing going on in the mix. There's decor behind it, but it's intentionally the center of the soundstage at one moment, and then having softer sounds amidst that, so that your dynamic range, you're maximizing your dynamic range at most levels of your composition. That doesn't mean that you are maximizing at every level, right? Things like reverb is inherently going to reduce your dynamic range in that moment when it's used. So it doesn't mean that reverb is not used at all. It just means that that use is intentional and that you're reducing your dynamics in that moment intentionally, and then going back to featuring one thing at the center of the soundstage and kind of working your composition out in that way, as opposed to throwing everything on the soundstage at once and seeking to be loud at the same time. It's not to say that layer cake mixes are bad. It's just to say that if you're seeking to be loud, then this yoking of dynamics so as to engage and reset this tympanic reflex that occurs in our middle ear consciously and intentionally by incorporating soft sound or no sound amidst huge sounds. And I think so I've heard a lot of people like Ill Gates and Mr. Bill talk about checkerboard and layer cake, and I've heard a lot of scientists talk about the tympanic reflex, but I haven't seen anybody put these two together and present them in such a way. So that's kind of what I wanted to do here in this video. And yeah, I hope it helps. And yeah, check me out on SoundCloud and Bandcamp and all the platforms. But yeah, much love to all you audio nerds, and hit that like and subscribe if you enjoy this content, and share it out. Much love, y'all. Peace.